I'm pleased to welcome you to this ADRN online seminar series number 15. This is jointly sponsored by the Asia Democracy Research Network, or ADRN, and the East Asia Institute, which serves as the secretariat of ADRN. This afternoon, we will discuss the topic, Exploring Direct, Deliberative, and Participatory Democracy in Asia. We have a stellar panel of speakers this afternoon. Let me introduce them to you one by one. First, I would call on Doljon Aldar, who is consultant and board member of the Independent Research Institute of Mongolia. Good afternoon, Doljon. We also have Sri Nuryanti, researcher of the Indonesia National Research and Innovation Agency. Good afternoon, Sri.
Good afternoon.
After Sri, we have
Good afternoon.
Almi Azri Abdul Halim, researcher of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs of Malaysia. We also have Muhammad Asim, who is an analyst of Verite Research of Sri Lanka. Good afternoon, Asim.
Good afternoon, yes.
And after Muhammad, we also have Tawilwadi Burikul, we call her B, who is the Director of Research and Development Office of the King Prajahidpok's Institute of Thailand. We also have on the list Kaustuv Banyopadhyay, who is the Director of Participatory Research in Asia, India. I understand he's currently in a remote area and will try to send a video recording. So we'll see if he'll be successful in sending the video recording of his presentation. So let me just tell you a few things about this seminar this afternoon. First of all, let's define what is direct democracy. Direct democracy means involving the public directly in making decisions. By contrast, representative democracy involves the public choosing representatives who make decisions on their behalf. So this afternoon, we'll focus on direct democracy, although in the course of the discussion, we will refer to representative democracy and the dynamics between the two strands or variants of democracy. Asian countries are incorporating mechanisms or ideas of direct democracy into their political system, but may still face difficulties in implementing good governance. In order to examine diverse backgrounds and trends of democracy in Asia, the ADRN has invited speakers from 7 Asian countries to speak about their country's direct democracy trends. So this preliminary presentation would be based on research undertaken by our Asian colleagues. So this is an initial presentation because we will have a full-blown presentation with full analysis during the face-to-face workshop that the East Asia Institute will be hosting in August. So good afternoon, everybody. So what I'll do is to present the case of the Philippines. So I'll serve as the first speaker, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel. So I have been designated to be the first speaker this afternoon. So I'll just be sharing with you my screen. So by the way, each participant will be allotted 10 minutes to make a presentation. So let me now start. Direct democracy in the Philippines. By the way, I am Francisco Magno. I'm the founding director and currently senior fellow of the DLSU Jesse M. Robredo Institute of Governance, and have been a longtime member of the Asia Democracy Research Network. So let me start by citing a fundamental basis or fundamental anchor of direct democracy in the Philippines. A key provision in the constitution of the country or the fundamental law of the land is Article 13, Section 16, that emphasizes the right of the people and their organizations to effective and reasonable participation at all levels of social, political, and economic decision making. The state shall by law facilitate the establishment of adequate consultation mechanisms. So you can see in this constitutional provision that there is this enabling mandate for direct democracy in the country. I'll be citing other important laws in the country at the subnational level or at the local level. The 1991 Local Government Code provides the formation of local development councils, which are semi-autonomous components linked to local governments that allow for the representation of civil society organizations or non-government organizations in local development planning and budget prioritization. We should take note that the 1919 Local Government Code came after the 1987 Constitution. So you would take note based on the historical trends in the Philippines. The 1987 Constitution is a product of the People's Power movement that re-established democracy in the country after long periods of authoritarianism. There is also a law which provides for a system of initiative and referendum. And so we have a system of plebiscites and referendum where people are asked directly with respect to their approval of certain laws. And at the subnational or local level, there is also a provision where people are asked to approve of laws creating provinces. And I'll cite examples. For example, there was a plebiscite or referendum that happened last 2019 for the approval of the Bangsamoro Organic Law. And this law created the Bangsamoro Organic or the Bangsamoro region of Muslim Mindanao. So this is a product of the peace process between the Philippine government and the Bangsamoro MILF, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, that led to a peace agreement. And this is part of the peace process, an ongoing peace process in the southern part of the Philippines. Another example was a recall election. So a petition can be made by a certain percentage of voters in province or local government. And this is an example where in 2015, a recall election was made to hold an election for the mayor of the city, even though the regular elections are not yet happening. So we have this direct democracy mechanism. Aside from the referendum, we have the recall election at the subnational level. Now, I'll go to some of the mechanisms under the local government code that I mentioned. An example of this is the creation of the Local People's Council, provided in several local governments that decided to have local policies, creating local people's councils, which is an addition to the local development councils that are already provided under the local government code. But the local government code also encourages local governments to develop other policies for public participation. And this is a case of the creation of local people's councils in the city of Naga. And the People's Council is empowered to observe vote and participate in the deliberation, implementation, and evaluation of projects, activities, and programs of the city government. The People's Council can designate representatives to all city council committees and suggest and vote on proposed legislation at the committee level of the city council. Another important new development is the use of digital democracy. And you can see here a photo of a young mayor, Mayor Vico Soto of the city of Pasig, who has allowed the use of digital platforms to get the opinion and approval of people with respect to certain policies. For example, you can see here in the screen the proposal of the city government to create new rules on speed limits, or lowering down the speed limits in the streets of Pasig City. But this is done through the application of online platforms. So in a way, it's a kind of a referendum, but using online platforms in a particular city in the Philippines. Now let me go to different mechanisms on participatory planning and budgeting, because these are direct democracy mechanisms that have been introduced over the past several years. And these are participatory planning and budgeting mechanisms throughout the budget cycle, from budget preparation to budget approval, execution, and implementation through the process of accountability. So these are several types of mechanisms that have been introduced over the past 6 or 7 years. For example, budget partnership agreement, the bottom-up budgeting, and citizen participatory audit. So you can see in this matrix, these are the different activities in the budget cycle. And if you see the X sign, then these are the areas where these mechanisms are being undertaken. So let me go now very fast on these mechanisms. The bottom-up budgeting is one of the mechanisms wherein village level local governments. We have village level local governments, and they are elected. They participate in identifying priorities of local governments, and they are submitted at higher levels of government. So village level residents are asked to identify budget priorities. So a series of workshops, assemblies are undertaken to ensure that budget priorities of local villagers are incorporated in the budget of higher levels of government, including the municipality, the province. These are higher level governments, and a national, also as part of national development budget plans. Now I want to share you a mechanism on budget monitoring and budget auditing, project auditing. And this is the citizen participatory audit that was pursued almost 2 decades ago, but it was only over the past several years that this kind of citizen mechanism has been incorporated, in fact, institutionalized in various agencies. So the project was intended to reduce corruption in road projects. So this is the picture of the founder of this civil society organization that undertook road watch projects. And this road watch experience has been incorporated in various platforms, even in partnership with the national government. So as I mentioned, it is now streamlined in the Commission on Audit. This is the state agency that has the power to audit government projects and programs. And Another important mechanism is the open government partnership that has enabled many of these direct democracy mechanisms. The Philippines is a member of Open Government Partnership. In fact, a founding member of the Open Government Partnership since 2011. Now, I'll go to the last remaining slides because I'm given only 10 minutes for this presentation. So in terms of the analysis of direct democracy in the Philippines, I discuss in this paper the enabling conditions or the supply side. Because I look at direct democracy as a combination of government enabling mechanisms as well as civil society demands in the process. So in terms of enabling conditions on the part of government, we find the installation of democratic space since the replacement of authoritarianism in the mid and late 80s, the establishment of enabling rules and legislation. I discussed the local government code, the Philippine Constitution, and other relevant laws. The pursuit of open data, with citizens' access to reliable public documents and data, including the transparency seal in national agencies, full disclosure policy applied at the subnational levels, a right to information policy in the executive branch, although we still don't have a freedom of information law that is applied throughout the government. It's only at the executive branch. And capacity building for government agencies on public participation. So these are examples of open data now provided through the website of the Department of Budget and Management of the Philippine government. This is some kind of a citizen's budget. Infographics are used so that people can easily be informed about what's happening with respect to the national budget. So this is posted in the website of the Department of Budget and Management. And a full disclosure policy portal hosted by the Department of the Interior and Local Government, wherein all local government units from provinces, cities, and municipalities are mandated to share their financial documents online with their constituents. So this is part of the open data process. And recently, the Philippine government passed a law. It's called the Seal of Good Local Governance, but it started as a program providing incentives for participatory governance, where the mandated functions of local governments are posted, and local government units are supposed to perform all these functions of disaster preparedness, social protection, peace and order, environmental management, business friendliness and competitiveness, tourism, culture, and arts, but ensuring that there is transparency, participation, and accountability. And also the Department of the Interior and Local Government is now providing data on how infrastructure projects are being undertaken, feedback on local infrastructure projects through online platforms. It's called DevLive. So people can monitor the progress of infrastructure projects through this program. It's a way of leveraging technology for citizens and government. In terms of enabling conditions on the demand side, as I mentioned, there's supply side, there is demand side. On the demand side, it's the availability and accessibility of independent media that enable the public to engage in decisions pertaining to public issues. There's also the capacity, legitimacy, representativeness, responsiveness, and accountability of civil society actors. For example, I cited the case of the pork barrel scam, and this is an issue of corruption with respect to the funds of Parliament or Congress in the Philippines, where funds are channeled to non-existing NGOs. So this was exposed through media, and Philippine Daily Inquirer is an is a media organization that exposed this pork barrel scam. And because of this, there was an online petition to probe the 10 billion peso pork barrel scam. Pork barrel refers to a legislation to finance infrastructure projects. So the online petition asked the anti-graft agency of the government to investigate the case, and there was a rally, a huge rally of people to join the protest against pork barrel. So this is just an example of how direct democracy mechanisms were undertaken, and it goes at different levels. And in my analysis, I will explore the possibility of tying all these levels of direct democracy together. And moving forward, these are my recommendations: a passage of the Freedom of Information Law, legislation of participatory budget mechanisms at national and subnational levels, integrate citizen participation in civic education, promote open data, conduct data analytics, and develop visualization tools for effective planning, build database on citizen participation to aid policy reform efforts. And as part of the analysis, it's really a mechanism is needed whereby the full disclosure policy of the government can really be operational. And one way to improve that is to bring in local knowledge stakeholders and developing platforms that can serve as information intermediaries in translating open government data into knowledge products that can be used for policy advocacy. So as a final comment, in my paper, I will analyze how to bridge the gains from direct democracy and the challenges of representative democracy. Because even though there are mechanisms for direct democracy where the public participates in decision-making processes, the clear challenge is the persistence of political dynasties who are successful in representative democracy through elections and the continuity of authoritarian populism in the country. So thank you very much for taking time to listen to this presentation. And now I would like to call on Doljan Aldar, who is a consultant and board member of the Independent Research Institute of Mongolia, to make her presentation. Doljan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you can proceed now.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Can I share my screen too?
Yes, you can share your screen.
Okay. Yes, so we are currently working on our working paper called Direct Democracy History and Trends in Mongolia, together with my colleague Tamir, on behalf of the Independent Research Institute of Mongolia. So glad to be presenting our progress so far. So I prepared my presentation quite broadly, given that it's only 10 minutes, so we cannot go into detail that much. But during the Q&A session, if you have any specific question, we can discuss. So first of all, long story short, the conclusion we are making, whether there are institutional mechanisms for direct democracy in Mongolia, whether there is a direct democracy in Mongolia, we would answer it's very limited. There is very limited space for direct democracy in Mongolia, especially when we consider the classical definition, whether people are directly voting about the issues that interest them or that affect them, relevant for them. Are they voting? No, we don't see such direct voting so far. So just black and white from that definition wise, we do not have direct democracy as much as we would like to. But of course, when we talk about more broadly, maybe using less strict definitions. Are public participating, citizens participating? Are there mechanisms allowing that kind of participation? Yes, there are some progress on that. Also, another thing I want to mention is that since the 1990s democratic transition, like Philippines and many other countries in Asia, Mongolia was also an authoritarian regime for more than 70 years. So in that sense, since the transition in 1990s, there has been a lot of progress made. But since then, we still don't have any referendum that has taken place so far, which is also quite telling that, yes, there is no broader national scale participation. And the key mechanisms for allowing public participation in decision-making or in various stages of governance, such as planning, budgeting, monitoring, etc., exist. Very similar to the previous presentation made by Professor Magna. For example, we have unlike Philippines, we have a national law on right to information and transparency, enacted in 2011, if I recall correctly. We have also several mechanisms allowing public hearings, petitions, and complaint, and making the government mandatory to respond to these complaints and petitions. We also have mechanisms to allow people in participating local budgeting, especially setting priorities for investments, but at the local level. We have a law on referendum. It hasn't been used yet for many reasons we explore in our paper as well, why the referendum has still not been used and not the popular option for direct democracy. Also, the latest related law was on deliberative polling, passed in 2017. So in our paper, we briefly present each of how these laws and legislation mechanisms allow for public participation, but also we examine what are the challenges and how they could be improved. So brief history about direct democracy. So constitution of the first democratic constitution of 1992 sets the foundation for direct democracy. It recognizes that the people of Mongolia shall directly participate in state affairs. So this clause is very important. Following that, in 1995, we had the law on referendum passed. And around 2010s, we had the surge of a lot of laws on allowing and expanding public participation in governance. So in that sense, yes, Mongolia has the key mechanisms allowing for direct democracy, and they are laid out. But the general observation we have is that these laws are not fully implemented in practice, or there have been a surge of other contradictory laws that restrict the implementation of these legislation and mechanisms that allow for direct democracy. So this is the general progress so far. And in terms of trends, so what has been happening in the last 10 years or 20, even more than 20 years, is that like in many other countries, we are looking at digital transformation and the use of technology in state-citizen, regulating state-citizen relationships. Just this year, 2 months ago, the Parliament of Mongolia launched a new application called Parliament, Digital Parliament. We have a national program and even a separate committee, governing body focusing on digitalizing government services and speeding up the process of delivering services, etc. So there are a lot of progress in terms of facilitating and making services easily accessible. But again, like in previous sections I explained, whether this digital transformation has contributed in people directly voting or indirectly changing policy, recalling politicians, or their initiatives taken seriously and implemented, in those kind of qualitative terms, it hasn't contributed so far. It has mostly helped state to citizen kind of one-way relationship, but not so much from citizen to state feedback, and especially influencing directly decision-wise. Not so much progress so far. So that's one trend we're observing, but we hope that if this digital transformation is taken seriously and focus more on providing actual empowerment to the people in terms of decision making, there could be some opportunities. Another worrying trend we are observing since the late 2010s is that not just in terms of direct democracy, but the overall democracy-wise, also there are some setbacks and steps back in terms of this mechanism. So key examples are the law on state and official secrets that significantly restrict the other law I mentioned earlier, the right to information, for example, by allowing government to classify almost any type of information to classify as secret. As a result, not follow the processes required by the right to information law. So that's just one example. The current parliament does not have a dedicated standing committee on petitions and complaints. This was dissolved. For example, just 1 year, the parliament received, the population size is relatively small. So the number might seem very low, but still it received around 2,000 complaints, proposals and feedback, and has addressed them. So it shows that this was a direct mechanism between the parliament and the people to connect and respond to people's needs, but this was dissolved. And instead, this digital parliament application came up. And especially given the lack of digital access and the widespread digital divide, and just people don't know that such application exists so far. So we need to see a bit more how the parliament application or other ongoing digital initiatives will unfold. But generally what we observe is that there is the lack of proponents of for direct democracy. We have discussions and ideas promoting democracy, but very few are saying the people need to directly vote and people need to directly make decisions about key issues. So this kind of discussion we are not observing. And instead now there are a lot of efforts, for example, to do another constitutional amendment, to change the electoral system and how to fix the parliamentary system. So the discussion and focus is more on the representative democracy rather than direct democracy so far. So the second part of our paper explores what are the popular claims for democracy. We put in brackets the word direct because, as I mentioned earlier, there's no really direct, strong proponent for that. Due to lack of time, I'll skip that and I'll focus on the popular claims against direct democracy. So these include things like there are a lot of national claims saying that those who are talking about democracy, especially even so, the direct democracy, are so-called pro-American liberals, and they don't understand our culture and context, so they should be feared. So now there's a lot of pushback against kind of democratic movements or efforts. This kind of national claims becoming more popular. One of the foundations for that is national security concerns, saying we are Mongolia is situated between two neighbors that are Russia and China, so we shouldn't talk about too much freedom. We should be careful when talking about these topics. So this kind of justification is also used. Similarly, civil society organizations should be restricted. They should be controlled and regulated by the state. It's becoming another movement. Democracy leads to inequality. So here I put a picture hashtag on top says democracy, and on the right hand side you can see the Democrats who are enjoying their lives by the pool, the car, playing polo. On the left hand side, the voters of democracy living poor life and crying and pollution and all of that. So this is also a common explanation for lack of democracy not contributing to people's well-being and quality of life. Another popular claim is that now Mongolia needs to have a long-term vision and focus on prosperity rather than keep voting on issues, keep going back and forward, talking about accountability and losing a lot of time on that. Instead, let's just focus and develop. Which sounds really nice, but at the same time, the danger is that it is making a bit the process of democratic participation a bit blurry. And the very popular idea is that the masses are inherently uneducated. They are the literal translation is black mass. They cannot make decisions for themselves, so it's dangerous to include them in the decision-making process. Yes, so here's just one example I used from the Asian Barometer survey from 2018. Compared to other Asian countries, Mongolia is still relatively well in terms of if we have political leaders who are morally upright, we can let them decide everything, which is the opposite of direct democracy. Here, the mean score of the respondents who said closer to strongly disagree was the more people disagreed than agreed to this statement compared to some of our other countries in Asia. So that's it from my side, and happy to receive any feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doljon, for that presentation. So you clearly juxtapose those arguing for more direct democracy versus those who would like to make certain restrictions on direct democracy. So we'll have more discussions on that during the open discussion. So thank you, Doljon. Let me now call on Sri Nuryanti, who is a researcher at the Indonesian National Research and Innovation Agency.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sri Nuryanti, and I would like to share the presentation now. I will be a very quick one. Can you see my presentation? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I put the title like this: Examining Direct Democracy in Indonesia, and I write down the article with my colleague Devi Darmawan. As introduction, Indonesia as a democratic country has laws that regulate the working implementations of democracy. One of these laws stipulates that Indonesia acknowledges the practice of direct democracy. Indonesia has implemented direct democracy in the past in the form of referendum. Notable examples are the referendum to amend the 1945 Constitution and the referendum held by East Timor Province to vote on their affiliation to Indonesia. East Timor Province now is Timor-Leste. So if you see Timor-Leste, then it used to be part of Indonesia, and it used to be part of our province. We call it East Timor. During the referendum, the people of East Timor were asked to determine their citizenship status. East Timor voters were asked whether they would like to remain affiliated with Indonesia or become independent. The East Timor area was historically annexed by Indonesia during Suharto's presidency. Suharto is the second president of Indonesia. He used to be the president for 32 years. So, and he used to be the president during New Order period. The referendum was the consequence of UN resolution calling for the right to self-determination. So this is part of how the Indonesia actually agree to have the referendum for East Timor. And I think it is facilitated by the economic crisis that was happening in Indonesia, especially in 1997, and also the political reform that was happening in May 1998. So we host the referendum for East Timor under UN supervision. Theoretical framework, as I may quote here, I just put at least two things. Direct democracy is the implementations of democracy without proxy. So I think I do agree with what Francisco mentioning earlier. And the second theoretical framework that I put is the most prominent form of direct democracy today in Indonesia is referendum and election, in which citizens allowed to express and choose their preferences. Regarding the two referendum types, the electorate usually choosing to answer a simple question offered by the referendum committee, whereby people choose their executive candidates directly. A popular referendum empowers citizens to make a petition that calls a popular vote over existing legislation. A special committee for hosting referendum formulates the time frame for a valid petition and the required signature. This is the process that I will mention a bit. They may require signature from diverse communities to protect minority interests. This form of direct democracy effectively grants the public the option to veto laws adopted by the elected legislature. Aim and purpose of this paper, actually, this paper will analyze the implementations of direct democracy in Indonesian context. It will examine the mechanism of direct democracy in Indonesia, the historical context behind the call for the East Timor referendum, and its legal basis. We find that in Indonesia, the practice of two forms of direct democracy, in this example is referendums and general elections, were practically happening in Indonesia. We focus particularly on the referendum to amend the 1945 Constitution and the referendum that held in East Timor. Later we call East Timor province to become Timor-Leste. In general election, Indonesia also directly elects its executive for the president and the vice president, the governor and the vice governors, the mayor and the vice mayor, the region and the vice region, and the head of the village. Also, the representative in national and local level. So we do have the direct election for choosing directly the executive level, the parliament and executive level. The referendum to amend the 1945 constitution was the very crucial thing, because we used to believe that 1945 constitution never been changed, but presidential decree number 5, 1985 laid out the requirements for a referendum for the 1945 constitution, stating that such amendment would only be allowed through a referendum. In this decree, a referendum is defined as an active to directly ask whether the people agree to with the wishes of the People Consultative Assembly. But the referendum must be supported by at least 90% of public opinion givers or voters. As a result, we do have the amendment of 1945 Constitution, and the referendum is actually only adjust some of the verses. On referendum that held in East Timor, I would like to mention a bit on this. Under the leadership of Suharto, historically, Indonesia carried out a military invasion that ended in the annexations of or forcible incorporations of Timor-Leste into Indonesian territory. At that time, we call East Timor province. When Habibie became president, the autonomy of East Timor became a crucial issue. Demands were made by countries beyond Europe and Asia for Indonesia to carry out political reform, and particularly to help Timor-Leste or East Timor determine its own destiny. In this regard, Portugal, as a former clone of East Timor or Timor-Leste, demand the Indonesian government jointly determining the future of Timor-Leste. As a result, Indonesia and Portugal concluded an agreement on May 5th, 1999 in New York under UN corridor. The agreement laid out the procedure for hosting public opinion in a confidential, direct, and universal manner. During the referendum, all of East Timorese people will be provided 2 questions. First, do you accept special autonomy for East Timor within the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia? And the second, do you reject the proposed special autonomy for East Timor, which will lead to the separations of East Timor from Indonesia? And the result of referendum is like this. The result was announced in Dili. This is the capital city of East Timor on September 4th, 1995. Out of total 438,968 valid votes, 344,580 or about 78.5% people voted for independence, while about 21.5% people of East Timorese choose to remain with Indonesia. Therefore, we can call that the participation rate in the referendum was very high, with about 98.6% of all registered vote were casting the ballot. The result of the referendum led to the official separations of East Timor province from Indonesia. The second direct election, the second direct democracy that I will going to explain is on direct general election. As I already mentioned a bit earlier, that Indonesia directly elects its executive of the president and the vice president, the governors of and the vice governors, the mayor and the vice mayor, the region and the vice region, as well as the head of the village and the representative in national and local level. We used to have the indirect election. We used to have the president and vice president elected by our MPs, not by us, not by the voters directly. Therefore, I think we have to put it as part of how Indonesia perceive that direct election as part of how we could survive with the direct democracy. So it was started in 2005, and I think I need to mention here that in Indonesia, all the executive are voted, are elected in pair. So president and vice president, governor and vice governor, mayor and vice mayor, region and vice region, and only the head of the village that elected on only one person. So this is the practice of direct election in Indonesia. As a conclusion, various literature studies studying the advantage of direct democracy. However, the democratic transition in Indonesia shown the pathway to consolidation by emerging the direct election not only for president and vice president, but also for the executive at local level. The strengthening of direct democracy practices thus deem the democratic institution to ensuring the well functions of civil society organization and other interest group to engage in decision-making policy. In the end, this direct democratic practice has successfully bring Indonesia to be resilient from democratic setback, whereas at the same time have to fight back for reducing the popular votes, raising populism to expand their power. This is something that I think I need to present today. So thank you very much for the time to listen to my presentation and get back to you, Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sri, for that comprehensive presentation of the referendum process in Indonesia. So we'll have more discussions in our open discussion. So thank you, Sri. Let me now call Halmi Asri Abdul Halim, who is a researcher of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS, in Malaysia. Halmi, please limit your presentation to 10 minutes.
Hi, good evening, good morning for everyone, wherever you are. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible with my slides. I have about 12 slides to share with the group. Essentially, we talk about Malaysia. It has struggled in terms of its processes with democracy. All right, so I hope the slides is viewable for everyone. So basically, we talk about Malaysia. Some of the challenges that we are facing would occur more recently with a lot of transition happening simultaneously within the space of 2 to 3 years. We've had 3 different governments going through at our country. So starting off, essentially the paper that I put in terms of a synopsis is to mention that the Sheraton Move, which was a political move done by the existing government at that particular time, a coalition, had broken up. So they were doing a meeting at the Sheraton Hotel. That's why it's called the Sheraton Move. And also the simultaneous timing of it that occurred right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit Malaysia. That was in 2020. 2 years ago. So there was a political and also a constitutional crisis added with the public health situation that was continuously affecting everywhere around the globe. So coming back to the issue of politics, whereby Malaysia saw its first transition in government from a 60-year rule by the former government known as the National Front. So the first transition, democratic transition, occurred in 2018. So we shifted our federal government, and unfortunately that government did not last long. It only managed to stay in power for about a year and a half, and therefore they was basically due to ideological splits within the party, and also members of its MPs hop into other parties. So the general election was basically invalidated by many ways by the politicians themselves, and that led to a lot of frustrations amongst the voters who felt as though their vote, they voted in a different government, but instead they were, after 1.5 years, another government came into power that were basically a coalition of the losers in the general election. So coming back, these are some of there's a timeline over there and some of the characters that are basically involved in the whole situation. So whereas voters become more disillusioned, the mistrust towards institutions was also added or heightened with periods of uncertainty in terms of leadership. And that's where we talked about opportunities to explore other forms of democracy. Here being the case of direct or participatory democracy. So it's being discussed amongst civil society members in Malaysia. And also there is a need to basically talk about lesser state interventions and the greater civil society organization empowerment. So Malaysia has always been historically a very top-down country, and now there are movements or movements on the ground that basically talk about a bottom-up approach. So yeah, next in the slide would be this. So basically this is the transition from government. So on your left-hand side, you see the former coalition of government that basically ruled for 6 decades. And then you had the short-lived Pack of Hope or the Pakatan Harapan government that was basically a coalition based on very progressive politics of opposition that won but did not sustain. And now you have the National Alliance, a coalition formed from the losers of the previous general election that has essentially a breakaway or splinter parties from the previous two coalitions. So you have parties from the National Front as well as a Pack of Hope that deserted their parties and formed the National Alliance under the current government. Okay, and moving on to this one. So basically in the paper, I talked about how there were basically the self-collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government. There was a lot of ambiguity, as well as we talk about how there was an undemocratic rise from the National Alliance, the new coalition that basically hits the government at the moment. That also did not sustain. The 8th Prime Minister basically was forced to resign or basically left office. And basically now we have a minority government. And this government is very fragile and it has been forced to sign a memorandum of understanding to carry out reforms. However, that memorandum of understanding between the political parties, between the opposition bloc and the very fragile government has also garnered a lot of backlash. People were not happy because, again, supporters from both sides of the party basically says that there's issues whereby they were not consulted, the public was not being brought involved into the discussion, that politicians are determining the direction of the country, whereas it was the politicians themselves that created the mess or the crisis in terms of political and constitutional crisis. So how can they be expected to solve? Why wasn't the people or the public consulted? So those are some of the things that are being brought or discussed. And there were a lot of societal double standards occurring throughout COVID-19. So the paper later goes on, whereby I was detailing in terms of how historically Malaysia has practiced a representative model of democracy, so indirect democracy. There are many reasons to it. The paper touches on it. We also have a constitutional monarch, and we borrowed heavily from the Westminster model, which is an inheritance from the British colonization period. So basically, Malaysia has a very complex power structure, diverse social makeup, and at its very top level, the monarchs themselves also have a consultative, what you call this, a format amongst themselves. So amongst the king and the monarch families, they have a consultative measure. But again, the discussion on democracy coming down to the ground level has been in Malaysia been very limited, as only the lower house parliament or basically the state assembly men or women are elected. So that's only one particular component within the three branches of government that are elected directly from the public. The rest are all either appointed or basically suggested by politicians to the king, and for the appointment be made by the king. And in terms of politics in Malaysia, we have a lot of to the context. Many scholars such as Dr. Meredith, and how you call this? There are a few other political science lecturers that talks about clientelism and patronage. So in Malaysia, politics is done in a way that MPs or potential candidates would do public engagement with the local level by bringing goodies or aid or basic necessities for them to basically use and to garner votes. Moving on, the paper talks about external developments. Malaysia being situated right in the middle of Southeast Asia allows us to be in tap or basically aware of our surroundings, particularly about on the issues of democracy. So countries such as Indonesia, such as Philippines, the development of democracy in these two particular countries definitely affects Malaysia, and how we have this bigger superpowers like China and India who also have challenges in terms of the democracy model are also adopted or basically affect Malaysia indirectly. As new generations are also quite open to the conversations about leadership decisions, we are seeing the discussion on direct democracy being far more advanced this time around compared to what you have perhaps 2 or 3 decades ago in Malaysia, as people back then would prefer to pass over discussions on policy or leadership decisions to their elites or to their local community leaders rather than they themselves be involved. However, younger generations are much more aware, much more participatory, and therefore these are some of the trends that we are basically identifying in the paper. That technology also is one big factor that encourages for more democracy to take place in Malaysia. All right, moving on to the next slide. The paper also touches on recent issues. So some of the things that could perhaps be challenges for this transition or acceptance of direct democracy in Malaysia would be on the issue of trying to capture a very large portion of semi-urban or rural constituencies in Malaysia. So there are basically, as I alluded to earlier, these communities in semi-urban rural constituencies in Malaysia would actually face much more difficulties in trying to get access to discourses, to how to say, democratic awareness. So they don't think about democracy that much. They rather think about the bread and butter issues, things that basically relate to their and their family's survival. So we talk about inequalities, therefore, they would definitely say that in terms of policy making, in terms of issues that are related to at the national level, it should be passed over or given to their representative. Hence, politicians and the local parties that are available at their areas. So that's why they like to delegate those things. And also in Malaysia, there are the 3 things that are basically quite growing in rampant, or basically has been in existence, and it creates a very big challenge in terms of race, religion, and corruption. So these three things makes discussion about democracy slightly more problematic. And I also allude to or basically concur with some of our previous speakers. Our friend from Mongolia was also saying that there was a label, or basically how democracy is being labeled or treated by being labeled in community that are very conservative, that say that if you talk about democracy, you talk about liberty, you talk about human rights, these are all foreign, these are all Western agendas, and therefore it should be rejected. And these are some of the narratives that makes it much more difficult. We want to bring into democracy when it comes back to the issue of race and religion. Social contract in Malaysia is being threatened. These are some of the narratives that are being played by the conservatives. And in Malaysia, when we talk about democracy, they basically, most Malaysians generally accept peace and freedom as being part of the process or benefits. However, they don't focus so much into greater detail in terms of good governance or justice, for example. So again, the issue of democratic education needs to be far more advanced, much more encouraged in Malaysia, and that will take time in particular. So these are some of the challenges. Continuing on, and normally when we talk about people who are very pro-democracy, that basically support the elements or aspects of direct democracy in Malaysia, they often belong to these four types, which are urban-centric, they have a background in activism, they have exposure to multiculturalism, and basically they belong into the young bracket in terms of age. So if they do not belong to any four of this, they would have the tendency to not support direct democracy and just maintain the status quo of passing over discussions, legislations, policy making to their representative, rather than go through direct involvement. However, nevertheless, when we talk about issues that are much more on the positive side, there is a growth of CSOs, civil society organizations, to deliberate and dissent in public spaces due to social media. So there are spaces on the digital platform whereby we can see people talking about democracy in a very robust manner. And basically there is also a growing volunteer culture in Malaysia. And the fact that current governments, due to their instability, due to their weaknesses of forming a majority, they are forced to basically come into consultations and do town halls with the NGOs. So this shows an acknowledgement of the role of NGOs or CSOs in society, that government, the age of government knows all has basically ended post GE14. So, but however, when you look at it from the timeline, this has been going on ever since 2008, whereby the opposition did a lot of effort to basically create more awareness. So it has been a very long process to get to this stage. And now governments do not bulldoze their policies, but rather they take into consideration opinions from civil society members, from community leaders, and the engagement or the decision-making process is much more inclusive in many ways. So these are some of the positives that you can see. Just a little bit more, if I may, Francesco, I'm at the four last slides. Yeah. So some of the efforts, we are also experimenting on a citizens' assembly, similar to what you have in Ireland or in Switzerland. So there will be a pilot project done by the Better Malaysia Assembly in Johor, which is a state in Malaysia, this coming August. Online petitions has been very popular in terms of the usage of change.org, recall elections by one of the CSOs, Bersih, and also open budget transparency, whereby public are invited to basically participate in monitoring state budgets. Yeah, okay. And a few final slides, if I may. Yeah, and emerging trends. So when we talk about this, there are more parties, new parties being created. There is talk about decentralization. And also when we talk about political literacy, there are also efforts by young groups talking about digital parliament being organized. And in conclusion, there is a weak government majority. The opposition is in disarray, and therefore, public through CSOs can make better involvement. However, the threat towards democracy is the return of potential return of corruption, or basically the previous governments, which are much more familiar amongst the voters. And in terms of next analysis, these are some of the things that we will be doing. Me and a team of research assistants will be participating to discuss further. Thank you, Francesco. I pass it over back to you.
Thank you very much, Almi. It's very comprehensive presentation on Malaysia. A lot has been happening, as I can see in your presentation. Now, I'll call on Muhammad Asim, analyst of Verite Research of Sri Lanka.
Yeah. Thank you, Francisco. I'm trying to share my screen. So,
yes.
okay, I think I can do it now. Yeah. Hope you all can see my screen.
Yes, we can see.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for ADRN and EI for this opportunity to present at this forum. So I'm here to share the Sri Lankan experience of promoting direct democracy through public engagement. So first part of our paper deals with the definition. Okay. So when we look at the history, the democratic government has mainly taken in two forms. One is the direct democracy, where the people as individuals participate in policy formulation and decision-making process. Second, representative democracy, where policy formulation and decision-making are undertaken by representatives who are elected by the people. And when we look at, when it comes to instrument of direct democracy, we have looked at mainly in two ways. First, formal instruments which has been there traditionally, such as referendum and vote recall, etc. Then second, we call it here alternative instruments. Alternative instruments allow citizens to be directly involved in governance, but it has not been traditionally perceived as an instrument of direct democracy, but also loosely falls within the scope of the direct democracy. And if we look into the context of Sri Lanka, so when you look at the development of the Sri Lankan constitution, Sri Lanka got independence in 1948 and adopted the Salisbury constitution, which was in practice at the time of the independence. Sri Lanka introduced its first republic constitution in 1972, and it was replaced by the Second Republic Constitution in 1978. There were no any formal traditional instruments of direct democracy in Sri Lanka, except the referendum, which was introduced in 1978 Constitution. But the Salisbury Constitution, which was in effect at the time of independence, had a Westminster parliamentary structure, which was governed by the Commonwealth parliamentary traditions. These Commonwealth parliamentary traditions had instruments where citizens could directly engage in government through instruments such as private members' bills, public petitions, and parliamentary questions. And these instruments had features that we would see in direct democracy. So what we want to do is we want to look at these instruments in detail. And so one of the the first instrument that we will be looking at is the referendum. So so the essence of a referendum is that it enables people to directly vote to decide on a law or a proposal. As per the Sri Lankan Constitution, a referendum can be taken in 3 occasions. First, the Constitution gives power for President to put forward a citizen any matter of public importance for the approval. Second, there are entrenched articles in the Constitution, and if any constitutional amendment proposed to make changes to those entrenched articles, that also required to go through the referendum. Thirdly, if the Supreme Court determines that a proposed bill is inconsistent with an entrenched article of the Constitution, will also require to go through a referendum. However, so as I mentioned earlier, the referendum was introduced in 1978 Constitution. It is noteworthy to mention that Sri Lanka has gone for a referendum only once in its history. And that was also 40 years ago. It's the first and last referendum that was held in Sri Lanka was in 1982. That was to kind of, to call off the parliament election and extend the lifetime of the parliament by another 6 years. And that kind of, at that time, the government which brought it, they kind of, got through that referendum, and they able to kind of postpone the election for about kind of 6 years. There are two kind of, critical shortcomings in Sri Lanka's framework of referendum that undermines its ability to be used as instrument of direct democracy. The first of this shortcoming is that a referendum can only be called by the president. There is no modality by which the people can mandate a referendum. The second shortcoming is that it is limited to approving bills at the parliament level and matters of national importance. Accordingly, the framework on referendum has no application to matters at the local level, thereby preventing communities from directly participating in policy making at the local government level on matters that are likely to impact them on a day-to-day basis. Then, the second instrument that we are discussing in our paper is the private members bill. A private members bill is a formal instrument that has the potential to be used as a citizen, used by citizens to directly be involved in legislative and policy formulation. There are two types of private members bills, and the first one is intended to affect or benefit a particular person, association, or a corporated body. We call it as incorporation bills. The second type, which is we are kind of interested here, is the bills that are intended to be advancing the public interest. So the modality of this using the private members bill is two-step process. First, a citizen or a civil society organization must advocate for and gain the support of a parliamentarian who is eligible to table a private members bill. Secondly, the said parliamentarian must sponsor the bill proposed by the citizen in parliament. Once the process is completed, the bill will be deliberated in parliament according to the generally accepted procedures. However, data collected by a parliamentary monitoring platform called Monthly.lk, so which is also managed by the organization I represent, called Monthly.lk, that revealed that between 2015 to 2021, during a 6-year period, there were a total of 209 private members bills presented in parliament. Yet, only 12 of those bills concerned matters of public interest. So rest of those private members bills were incorporation bills that were dealing with incorporating associations and corporates. So thus, it is evident that private members bills have been predominantly utilized as an instrument to regulate the affairs of incorporated bodies rather than instruments to address issues of public interest. So the third instrument that we are looking at in our paper is the public petition. Public petitions enable citizens to bring to the notice of parliament the flaws in the administrative machinery of the government and seek redress for grievances suffered. And aggrieved citizens can submit a petition to any parliamentarian requesting that matter contained in the petition be considered and resolved. Then the parliamentarian can endorse the petition and refer it to a committee of public petition in parliament. Once looking at the content of the petition, if public petition committee thinks or of the view there has been an infringement of citizens' fundamental rights, or if any other injustice has been caused to the citizen, then the committee will do an inquiry and may grant a due relief. Again, a statistic published by Monthly.lk, that parliamentary monitoring platform, reveals from 2015 to 2020 period, there were a total of 2,400 public petitions submitted to the Committee on Public Petitions by 181 parliamentarians out of 225 members we have. Of the 2,401 petitions, a total of 1,115 petitions, that's close to 50% of the petitions, were presented by just only 10 parliamentarians. This indicates that public petitions are neither extensively nor uniformly used by citizenry of Sri Lanka as an instrument of directly engaging with the government and administration. So the final instrument that we are discussing in the paper is the parliamentary questions. So when it comes to parliamentary questions, there are parliamentary questions are another instrument that have the potential to enable citizens to directly engage with parliament. In order to utilize this instrument, an individual or a group of individuals are required to advocate for and obtain the support of an eligible parliamentarian for the purpose of posing question on their behalf. So the very common type of question is called written questions for oral or written answers. This enables any member of parliament who doesn't hold any ministerial post to pose a question to the government. Those questions have been placed on the order paper, and this will take a minimum of 2 weeks to a month to get a response. But the standing orders of the parliament also allows the party leaders to ask questions on matters of public importance without waiting it to be included in the order paper and get a prompt response from the government. Moreover, parliamentarians are also entitled to direct up to 4 questions per month to the Prime Minister on the government policies. Accordingly, citizens can urge their representatives to take advantage of the opportunity to ask parliamentary questions and held government answerable and accountable. Again, statistics by Monthly reveal that during 2015-20, a total of 2,372 questions were raised by parliamentarians. Of these questions, 1,324 questions, that approximately 56% of the questions were raised by just 10 parliamentarians. Similar to private members' bill and public petition, the instrument of parliamentary question also appears to be inadequately and ineffectively used for the purpose of direct engagement with the matter of governance. So next section of the paper looks at the challenges in using these instruments for direct democracy in Sri Lanka. So the first challenge that the paper identifies is the absence of mechanism to mandate the implementation of above instruments. Although parliamentary standing orders provide for presenting a private member's bill, public petition, and parliamentary questions, this instrument will be presented to Parliament only if the parliamentarian who has been approached by a citizen agrees to submit before the Parliament. None of the framework of these instruments contemplate a mechanism by which a citizen or group of citizens can trigger a mandatory action by parliamentarian. This challenge also arises with regard to referendums, as the ability to call a referendum is vested solely in the president, and it cannot be triggered by people with respect to matters of national or local kind of importance. So the second challenge that we have identified is the inadequate mechanisms to improve parliamentary accountability. There is a lack of mechanisms that improve and assure the accountability of the parliamentarians. For instance, there is no mechanism by which a petition submitted by a citizen can be tracked and the concerned citizen to know the status of the petition. Further, Sri Lanka is yet to implement a mechanism that calls parliamentarians to report their progress on a monthly or annual basis as a public representative. These gaps in holding parliamentarians accountable enable them to exercise discretion without sufficient checks, thereby undermining the ability of citizens to fully instrumentalize the framework of private members' bill, public petitions, and parliamentary questions. Then the third challenge that the paper has identified is the systemic and structural issues that inhibit access to instruments of direct engagement. In Sri Lanka, certain systemic issues have significantly inhibited access to such institutions and instruments. For example, though parliamentary proceedings are physically and virtually accessible for public, these proceedings are limited to proceedings of the main chambers of parliament. Proceedings of the numerous committees and subcommittees of parliament which deliberate on matters of public interest are not accessible to the public. The other systemic issue is lack of women representation in formal politics, which inhibits female citizens from exercising their democratic rights by effectively engaging with the country's democratic institution. These are just two examples that we have included. There are more systemic issues. And the final section of the paper gives suggestions for areas of improvement. And the first suggestion is that expanding the scope of the referendum. As I mentioned earlier, at the moment, referendum can be called only by the president. So Sri Lanka could resolve this problem by adopting a system similar to that of Switzerland, where the people can trigger a referendum. Sri Lanka can also explore introduction of referendum for resolving legislative and policy issues at the local government level by allowing citizens to trigger referendum through proposals once they receive an endorsement or signatures from a sufficient portion of the constituency. Then the second suggestion for the improvement is introducing mechanisms to mandate the implementation of formalized instruments. So as discussed, as we discussed before, currently the formal mechanism of direct engagement have no threshold or trigger by which they are mandatorily implemented. Therefore, citizens should introduce procedures. Therefore, Sri Lanka should introduce procedures that trigger the automatic implementation of such formalized instruments in specific circumstances, such as when a petition or proposal has been endorsed or signed by a specific number of citizens. Then the final suggestion that we have made in the paper is introducing mechanisms to increase accountability of public representatives. So although Sri Lanka recognized private members' bills, public petitions, and the parliamentary questions as formalized instruments that allow citizens to directly engage with parliament, the successful implementation of all of such instruments is contingent on effective implementation and follow-up by parliamentarians. Thus, Sri Lanka can explore the possibility of introducing mechanisms that permit the monitoring of utilization of such instruments by citizens and parliamentarians, while also raising general awareness of the utility of such mechanism among the general public. So actually, our paper concludes this with this this recommendation. And yes, thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thank you very much, Muhammad Asim, for that good presentation and also proposals to improve direct democracy in Sri Lanka. So let us now go to our last but not the least panel member, Tawilwadi B. Burikul from KPI Thailand. You may proceed, B. Please unmute yourself, B.
And please share screen อันนี้ป่ะอันนี้นะใช่ป่ะมันไม่ไปอ่ะ Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
ทำไงให้มันเต็มจอ Okay, let me start. Okay, the paper is the Exploring Direct, Deliberative, and Participatory Democracy in Asia. We have been conduct this research based on the framework that given to us. The direct democracy here is a form of democracy beyond representative democracy, and direct democracy seems to be very interesting here because it's part of the communication technology revolution in Thailand, and it seems to be the better tool when policy making process require deep information that the experts do not know, but we can hear from the public, and it's the institutionalized process that the people can express their opinion on specific issue via the ballot consisting of initiatives or referendums and plebiscite. Okay. Next. Sorry with the mechanism. Okay, so let's look at this figure. From the score of direct democracy that studied by the I think it's read them. Yeah. This illustrates that the maximum score is 0.849 and the minimum score is 0. And the Thailand score is 0.088. That's the score of direct democracy. So it seems to be very low here. So we would like to see that to what extent that direct democracy is practiced in Thailand and how it can be improved in the future. So the objective of this study are to study the state of direct democracy in Thailand and to propose mechanism for strengthening direct democracy. And the methodology that we use are the literature survey from various sources, and also interviews with key informants. And also we have participant observation and focus group among the people related, because at KPI we have had some experiences with the process of direct democracy that I will mention afterward. So it's part of the methodology that we use. And the research questions are that how to describe direct democracy in Thailand, how direct democracy is applied in the Thai society, and what are the mechanisms for strengthening direct democracy in Thailand. And let's look at the history of direct democracy. Thailand changed from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy in 1932. And so far we have around 13 coup d'etat. So we see that the democracy go backward and forward from time to time. And the most important part that I would like to mention is that before 1997, there was people uprising. And then we had the Constitution 1997. That's very important because it's mandate a lot of direct democracy. Before 1997, there were several constitutions that provide for referendums for the constitutional amendments. The 1949 Constitution, the 1968, the 1974 and 1991 constitutions, and also the amendment of the Constitution in 1996 that also required the referendums. But after 1997, what does it mean? Okay. Okay. So after 1997, the constitution is beginning of direct democracy in Thailand, we can say, because this constitution provides an impeachment process and also allow the people participation, especially the people participation in legislative process through legislative initiative, and also allow having referendums on law. That means the referendum on law affecting the interests of the country from the previous limit to the constitutional amendment only. So after 1997, we can see that there are a lot of mechanisms that can identify direct democracy in Thailand, starting from referendums, recalls, also list in the constitution, and also law initiative, as well as unconventional political participation. And this is the first referendum on the Thai history that seemed to be very important and show the direct democracy that effective, because we need the new constitution that mandate a lot of public participation and good governance. So the first referendum under the constitution of the Kingdom of Thailand aimed to allow people to vote for approval or disapproval of the constitution. So the result come out that 97% of the people of Thailand, or eligible voter, approved the constitution, and 42% disapproved. And we can see that there's a cleavage among the region, because the north and the northeast mostly disapprove the referendum. So, and then Thailand is divided accordingly. And the second referendum occurred in 2016. This is the one that also allow people to vote on Thailand's draft 2016 constitution. So 59% of the people turned out to vote. And there were two issues for the referendum. The first one is for approval of the draft constitution. And the second one, allow the people to make decision whether they will allow the senators to vote for the prime minister. This is the first time in Thailand, and since then we have a lot of problems accordingly, because 2,050 senators can vote for the prime minister, so it become majority party in the parliament, because the member of the parliament or the lower house cannot have enough vote. So if they would like their leader to be the prime minister, they have to work in collaboration with the senators, and certainly the military support party have this opportunity. So the result come out like that. 61% of the people approved the constitution, mostly the area of the yellow one, and the people in the northeast that support the former Thai party or Thaksin, you know, the former prime minister of Thailand who exiled in Dubai. I mean, the favor for Thaksin disapproved with the draft constitution, and 58% of the people approved that senators can vote for the prime minister. And another mechanism for direct democracy in Thailand is law initiatives. This is very important for strengthening direct democracy, because it's the mechanism that the people can practice their right. It's starting from the 1997 constitution that allow 50,000 eligible voters to be able to propose a law. The law that related to right and liberty of the people and the public policy. So according to the 1997 constitution, there were 16 bills proposed to the parliament, and only one bill that passed the parliament and became the law. That is the health assurance law, because it support the policy of the government, so they allow this people's bill to pass the parliament. And then in 2007 constitution, we also have a referendum before that, and this time we see the problem with 50,000 eligible voters. It's very difficult to get all these numbers. So the constitution drafting member revised it to only 10,000 eligible voters. That's enough for propose the bill. And there were 51 bills proposed to the parliament, and only 8 bills were adopted and promulgated by the parliament and enacted into law. So you see, however, we also allow the people to propose for amendment of the constitution also. That means 50,000 eligible voters can propose to amend the constitution. And then for the recent constitution, that means 2017 constitution, 10,000 eligible voters can propose the law. And according to this, 71 bills were proposed. Because the long period of time that we were under the military government, the people were very frustrated. So they tried to propose their own idea and propose their own law. So they gather a lot of signature and document to prepare for proposing to the parliament and so that they can have the new law that support their way of life. But unluckily, until now, no bill has become into law. So zero bill adopted and promulgated by the parliament and enacted into law. And many bills could not pass the parliament because the problem with the financial issue in the law, in financial issues in the bill. If the bills propose to use some budget from the government, then those bills have to be approved by the prime minister, whether he agree with the bill or not. So many bills were rejected by the prime minister himself. So, and now we have a specific law or organic law according to the constitution. We call Initiative Process Act. We just passed it last year, and it make it easier for the people to bring in the legislation because we allow social media to be used for submitting the bill to the parliament. So we don't need some document anymore. So the people can propose the bill online. For example, and then signature, we don't need the paper, I mean the document into paper, but we need them to just submit by electronic mechanism. So that's part. And this is the example of the bill that are under the consideration of the parliament. The Indigenous People Rights Protection Law Initiative. This is the one that KPI support. According to the 2017 Constitution, so it guarantees the right of the people to propose the law. So that's why the indigenous group, the Hill tribe group, and also ethnic group, they form the association to propose the bill. And now there are 5 draft laws. So there are many groups that would like to have such kind of law. So 5 groups proposed the law into the parliament and now on the process. So it's very interesting. This is the picture that they proposed the bill and promote this bill among the public, and also try to convince the member of parliament to support, and also convince many group of people to support this bill.
Ivy, can you wrap up in a minute?
Okay, yeah. Yes. Okay, another one is recall process in Thailand. We had first recall, the recall for the Prime Minister. The second one is recall the Prime Minister. The first recall is the recall the member of Human Rights Commission, but it's not succeeded. And another informal recall by using the platform Change.org. This is the one that the people sign petition and show the signal to the parliament and also to the government. And this is the unconventional political participation that allow the people to demonstrate, to protest against the government. And there's another law that support this. Yeah, this is the part that people only 5% of the people that participate in unconventional political participation. So they still have a lot of problem in Thailand because referendum has become the political mechanism and no longer reflect the will of the public because it reflect the will of the politician instead. And the number of people still high to be able to be enough to propose the bill, and also the recall seem to be impossible. And the other form is increasing more importance. I mean, yeah, like change.org, but it's not legal. And so the trend of Thailand, that means we see the positive side of direct democracy in Thailand because there are a lot of public awareness on lawmaking, and social media become the mechanism for helping the people know about this mechanism. Okay, I would like to end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, B, for that presentation on Thailand. And it's unfortunate we don't have time left for our discussion, but we can continue doing so online. And of course, we'll have our face-to-face conference in Seoul in August. So I would like to thank my fellow panelists for this very engaging presentations. And I've learned a lot from all your sharing. And thank you to the East Asia Institute for serving as our secretariat.